What's up, everyone? We are diving back into the multiverse today for another epic. What if Naruto became Dragon Champion and built ultimate harem with Anko X, Kurenai X Ayame xTemari, and Tenten Part 2? If you enjoy this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more fanfics like this. Now, let's dive right into the fanfic. Temari was the first to reach Naruto and she couldn't help herself as she ran her hands on her lover's face and kissed Naruto right on the lips, and she sat next to Naruto, and allowed him to see her fully gnawed form at the moment, and she blushed at the look of utter passion, lust and more in the eyes of the blonde Chunin. She reached on and then touched Naruto's rock-hard COC and marveled at the feel of it. The sister of Gaara had to admit that this was the very first time she was with a man, and it would have made Gaara and Kankuro blow a gasket to find out that she was giving her virginity to a guy. But then again, this was Naruto here, the young man who had defeated Gaara and had become Gaara's best friend and bond brother, and Kankuro considers Naruto an all-right person to be with as well. This made her actions all the more easy to deal with at the moment as she kissed Naruto once more and relished the feel of his tongue dueling with hers in a very sensual way, showing that he had some prior experience with kissing, and it was very nice to know that, as it would mean that she could focus more on pleasing Naruto then than teaching him how to act around her in this kind of situation. The blonde genin recalled the time she had kissed Naruto and how far he had come, and she was loving this moment. She moaned out loud as Naruto took the offensive in a way and he moved his hands to her chest, massaged her breasts gently. Temari moaned out loudly at the action of the blonde Konoha Chunin while she continued to rub his rock-hard COC with her hands and marveling at the feel of it, as well as getting even water at the thought of tasting and feeling it every way possible. Tenten and Ayame were not far from the same idea as the Konoha weapon mistress made her way to sit next to Naruto, and she licked his neck gently and ran her own hands to Naruto's chest as she cooed at the sensation of feeling Naruto's hot skin, and the two of them were eager to see just how Naruto would feel and taste as well. Naruto barely had enough time when Ayame ran her hands on his COC at the moment, and the feel of her hands on his COC was very much a delicious sensation. Ayame had been planning this action for a very long time, ever since Naruto had rescued her and the others from Solana only a few weeks before, and she wanted to pay him back for rescuing her, and now the time had come for her to keep her promise. Ayame-san. Ayame smiled at the way Naruto said her name, and she then allowed Naruto see her breasts, and she decided to try something that she had heard about from some of her friends in the town, and despite the fact that she was not as well built as some of the other women in the village including Tsunade, she was more than able in her own right. She parted her breasts and allowed Naruto's COC to be covered on either side by them, and the feeling of it was so intense for Naruto that he couldn't help but feel even more aroused by the second. Naruto moaned at the feel of Ayame's breasts on his COC, and he was more than willing to lay back and let them have their way with him. After all, they lost the game, though he knew that in this case, no one really lost at all, and as soon as he was able to feel his release coming, he made it known to the three kunoichi that he was reaching his limits. "I'm going to." The three women smiled at that and they kneeled before him, and they were all eager for it, and sure enough, Naruto finally released his cum to them. Ah! Naruto's cum flowed out from his COC, and all three of them took their turns taking as much of it as they could into their mouths, and to their delight, the hot and thick liquid tasted sweet and delicious to them when they took it into their mouths, and Naruto watched as they allowed some of it to land on their faces and their breasts, and while he had seen that happen before, this was still a very delicious and arousing sight, and then he watched as Temari, Tenten, and Ayame cleaned themselves slowly and with great care as well. They swallowed his seed with smiles and blushes, and that sight before him was very delightful and arousing, and that allowed his COC to go back at full mast. As soon as they saw that, both Temari and Tenten were very happy, and the two of them took position on either side of his COC and began to lick and kiss it in regular turns, even doing it at the very same time. Naruto could only gasp at the pleasure that was hitting him at the moment, and he was still sitting on the bed, and it was then that Ayame had a very interesting idea. She still had a good amount of food preparation items and more with her when she came to Naruto's house, and now seemed like a very good time to get them into play. With that in mind, she moved to Naruto and whispered to him, "I have to get my things, Naruto-kun, I'll be right back." Naruto wanted to ask what were the things in question, but the bolts of pleasure that were shooting up his nerves from the actions of both Tenten and Temari were making the idea of him moving about rather unwelcome, and so he stayed there as Ayame left the room. This left the two kunoichi enough time to have their fun with Naruto until their companion got back. As they continued to lick and kiss Naruto's COC, the blonde kunoichi then made her move as she moved to Naruto's testicles and took them into her mouth slowly and played with them gently, and that was enough to make Naruto moan out Temari's name. Temari-chan, ah, Kami, that feels nice. Temari smiled at that and then released her lover's testicles slowly and then looked at him and spoke. Thank you Naruto-kun, but why don't we have another game until Ayame-san comes back? Tenten gave the blonde kunoichi a look that was questioning, and she asked the question as well, very curious to know just what was it that Temari had in mind at the moment. What sort of game are you planning now? How about the game in which we find out how many times can Naruto-kun make us cum? Tenten was a bit surprised but not offended, and she gave a grin as she licked Naruto's COC a bit more, and the weapon mistress looked at Naruto and Temari. Alright, I'm in, what about you Naruto-kun? Naruto nodded and both women decided to find out who would go first, and Tenten was happy to be the first and she kissed Naruto and allowed him to touch her body all over, and Naruto was more than willing to do just that. He ran his hands on her brias first and used his chakra to further enhance the pleasure that Tenten was feeling, and he then did the very same thing with his tongue as he kissed her deeply. The results were very good as Tenten was moaning out loudly at the pleasure, and despite her desire to win this game with Temari, she realized that Naruto was not going to go easy on her as he had every intention to make her cum first instead of him. But she was not going down without a fight, and she proved that to be true as she ran her hands on his chest and then his COC and testicles and made him moan as well. Temari watched the whole thing and enjoyed as best she could. Tenten was having a ball from the looks of things, and she was willing to make the attempt to make Naruto cum first, just for the spirit of competition. Tenten was enjoying this as Naruto slowly parted the kiss and made his way to her brias and began to lick and suck them, and she couldn't help herself as she moaned out even more in pleasure and desire. The brown-haired kunoichi was not to be outdone as she continued to move her hands on Naruto's COC, and the blonde chunin was more than willing to let her know how much he enjoyed her ministrations. However, Tenten finally reached her limit as Naruto's previous experiences with Tsunade, Kurenai, Anko, Shizune, Sakura, Ino, Kin, and Hinata had given him a lot of knowledge on how to find the right amount of pleasure and action to finally make her cum, and she came hard as she went through her very first orgasm. Ah! Tenten fell back with a smile on her face, and it was then that Temari took her turn and beckoned Naruto to come closer to her and also give her the very same pleasure that he had just given Tenten, and Naruto, being the gentleman that he is now, decided to accommodate Temari. The two blondes kissed one another, and then Temari lay back and allowed Naruto to view her dripping wet SX, and she was eager to let him pleasure her, and Naruto was more than willing to do just that, and he moved forward and began to lick her clitoris in her vagina, and since Temari was by all rights a virgin, she moaned out loudly at the pleasure that was hitting her senses. The reason was that she was the daughter of the former Kazekage, and she was considered as royalty to the people of Suna and thus was not easily approached by other young men. Not only that, her temper was there when she got riled, and naturally the fact that both Kankuro and Gaara were her brothers made most men very careful around her. However, Naruto was different. Not only had he helped their people many times over, but had defeated her little brother and also became Gaara's best friend, and had even confined Shukaku, allowing Gaara the chance to live a normal life, and for that, he was more than welcome in her eyes and that of her family. Of course she knew that both Gaara and Kankuro would react if they found out that she was going to lose her virginity to Naruto and make him her lover. Kankuro would explode in angry words, while Gaara was still unknown. However, since Gaara and Naruto were best friends and Gaara trusted the blonde chunin well, she had no doubt he would be more supportive of the whole thing than Kankuro. She then placed those thoughts aside for the moment and focused on the pleasure Naruto was giving her. Naruto once more used his chakra to his advantage, and the results were certainly proving to be worth the effort as she was releasing more of her juices, and that was something that Naruto liked greatly as he lapped up Temari's juices. He lapped up as much as he could and then was moving his hands to her brias, and then he licked her clitoris and used his free hand to play with Temari's inner sheath and took it further, and he moved his fingers deep inside of her vagina, and that made her all the more aroused, and Temari shouted louder each time he licked her clitoris, played with her brias and moved his fingers in her sheath. Ah! Harder! Temari was wailing in pleasure and bliss, and it was not long before she came fast and hard. She moved back and relaxed her breathing and shared a kiss with Naruto and tasted her very WN juices. That was something that made her blush even more. Ayame however arrived and she smiled as she spoke to the three of them, showing that she had been observing their antics for quite a while now. She had arrived and was about to try this out, but she decided to watch the show, and now that it was over, it was her turn to add to the festivities. You three have been busy. Now it's my turn to get involved, so we can stop with the games and get down to some very serious action. Naruto then wondered just what Ayame had in her hands at the moment. They were cooking tools, so why did she bring those with her? Ayame-chan. Yes. What's with the cooking spoon and the container? Ayame grinned in a very feline way, and that made Naruto gulp audibly. He had no idea what Ayame had in mind or why she was looking at him like that, and she replied. Why don't you lie down and just relax, Naruto-kun, because I think that the time has come to place some real sweetness to this situation. Naruto could only lie back as Ayame took out the small container or chocolate-flavored cream, and she smiled warmly as she began to cover his COC and testicles with it, and the cool feeling of the cream was so surprising that he thought he was imagining it all. As soon as she was done, the young woman smiled at both Tenten and Temari as they were more than eager to try this out, and all three of them crowded around Naruto's COC and testicles. Ayame was first and began to lick the cream, and she was quickly joined by both Tenten and Temari, and the three of them loved the act as they teased Naruto somewhat. You taste so good, Naruto-kun, I'm tempted to bite you. Temari said with a smirk as Naruto gave her a look of surprise, but she replied. But if I did that, then I won't have fun anymore. Tenten joined in as well as she licked Naruto's testicles. I have to agree, this is very nice. Tasting your skin was good, Naruto-kun, but with this on, I am very tempted indeed. Ayame then spoke gently. Easy girls, let's not tease Naruto-kun too much and let's just enjoy this night. Right. Naruto moved his head back and moaned even more as the three of them continued to lick his COC and testicles as those were covered in chocolate cream, and the sight of them doing this to him was so erotic that Naruto couldn't help himself anymore as he shouted out in pleasure, making the three women all the more aroused. And as soon as they had cleaned off every trace of the chocolate cream on both his COC and his testicles, he then came once more, fast and hard. And the fact that when he came, the women had chocolate cream in their mouths made them enjoy the taste of his cum all the more, as its sweetness now mixed with that of the sweetness and taste of chocolate. They swallowed his cum and relished the feel of it once more, and all three women licked their lips clean of the cream and his cum, making a very erotic sight before Naruto as he lay there. It was then that Ayame had a very interesting idea. She had heard of this being done before, and while some of her friends in the cooking ninja circles and in civilian life said it was not something done every day as it was very scandalous, she was able to understand it, and while she blushed as she realized why not many people talked about it, it was very interesting. She had gathered all she could in secret and now decided that it was time for her to put all that stock knowledge to good use. And it was a good thing that Naruto had a good-sized refrigerator and a lot of good things she could use. She decided to stop and asked Naruto to wait a moment, and Naruto, despite being slightly surprised by the sudden lull in activity, agreed. With that done and with both Tenten and Temari ready to listen, she decided to get her idea underway as she whispered into the ears of both Tenten and Temari her plans. As soon as she was done, both Kunoichi looked at Ayame with incredulous eyes and they gasped as they spoke. You've got to be kidding. Are you serious? Yep. I know how it's done. Besides, we want Naruto-kun to be at a full tank of energy, right? The two Kunoichi thought it over and began to smile at the idea. While they still though it to be somewhat very scandalous, they were more than willing to give it a try, and they talked it a bit more, and Temari smiled as she got to go first. Tenten was a bit put off in not being able to be the first to try the idea out, but warmed up to the idea of keeping Naruto occupied for the time being while Ayame made the preparations. With that done, they made their move, and Tenten decided to keep Naruto in good company while Temari and Ayame got their things together. Naruto was about to ask what they had in mind that seemed to make her and Temari blush, but Tenten merely replied. Think of it as a very special surprise, Naruto-kun, but I can't let you peek yet. Please. Tenten smirked at the pleading look in Naruto's eyes, and truth be told, she was tempted to try telling him the plan, but decided against it for the time being. The brown-haired Kunoichi began to kiss her lover's chest and nipping his own nipples lightly with her teeth, making Naruto moan and squirm, much to her delight on the whole situation. And after she was done, she reached for some of the leftover chocolate cream and placed it on her nipples, giving Naruto something to look at, and she smiled at him with an inviting and seductive look, and he needed no further invitation and dove right in, licking and sousing Tenten's brias and making her gasp and moan. As he removed the cream, he soused Tenten's nipple and then did the same thing to her other brias, and as soon as she was done licking off the cream, Tenten ran her hands down to his coc and testicles and played with them gently while once more kissing the blonde Chunin with all her might, and the pleasure for her mounted as Naruto reached down and began to play with her clitoris in her vagina. The moment his fingers touched her there, she gasped and gave Naruto a wicked smile, and then both of them began to play with each other's sex. Naruto began to feel Tenten's moisture on his fingers, and the moaning she made while her face was flushed with red was certainly telling him that she was enjoying that, and he wanted to hear her cry out in pleasure once more for both their sakes, and he reached for her head with his free hand, and then the two of them kissed deeply once more, and Naruto felt Tenten's hands play with his coc, and that was making him all the more heated. The two of them parted the kiss, and Naruto played with Tenten's brias once more and suckled on them, and he leaned back as Tenten made him do so, and she moved back to his coc and began to lick and suck on it, and she took it in deeply and moved her head slowly as to make sure she had every sensation placed in her deepest memories, and to also make sure that she gave her lover the same joy and pleasure that she was receiving as well. She was a woman who loved the chance to cover all her bases when she did something, and this was a very good chance to do just that and get a lot of pleasure out of it at the very same time. It was then that Ayame came on the scene and joined both Tenten and Naruto in a three-way kiss. The kiss lasted for quite a while, and then Ayame broke away, and while the brown-haired kunoichi was rubbing Naruto's coc on her brias and nipples, she rubbed his back and shoulders to relax her lover a bit, and then she looked at Tenten and gave her a nod. Tenten nodded and stopped her actions on Naruto, and that allowed Ayame enough time to kiss Naruto's neck and lick his earlobes. As soon as she was done, she began to rub her brias on Naruto's back, and that made Naruto all the more aroused, and it was then that she spoke. "Naruto-kun, Temari-san has something she wants to show you, take a look." With that, Naruto turned, and there before him was a sight that made his jaw drop. Naruto could only look at Temari as the blonde Suna Kunoichi, an elder sister of his friend Gaara and Kankuro, was lying there on the bed and covered in a very erotic picture. The blonde Suna ninja had white cream on her brias that covered them and her nipples as well, and on the cream that was on her brias were small grapes, and on the tips of her cream-covered brias were cherries. On her stomach was also a trail of cream and some sliced bananas there as well. And that led all the way to her vagina, which had been covered in white chocolate cream and had strawberries there as well. Wow! Ayame smiled and kissed Naruto on the lips and made him face her as she decided to explain just what was going on, while Tenten had to admit that despite the rather odd way it looked, it was very delicious looking, and she knew any man seeing the blonde genin like this would have really gotten their bodies hot. "I heard about this being done in some of the places I and my dad have been to. He told me it's all rumors, and the same thing too when I asked my friends, but I gathered enough to know it's real, and it's all for you, Naruto-kun." "Ayame-chan." Ayame smiled and licked Naruto's coc slowly from tip to base and back again, making him moan, and she smiled. "Don't turn it down, Naruto-kun, just enjoy it." Naruto gulped and made his way towards Temari, who was blushing deep red at the moment as she could see how lustful and hungry Naruto looked at her. However, the blonde was relieved as Naruto gently kissed her first, lovingly as well, and she responded back to the kiss. As soon as the kiss began to become even more torrid, they dueled with each other's tongues, and when that was done, Naruto made his way to her brias, and to the surprise of the blonde kunoichi, he began to lick away the cream slowly, relishing the taste of it all, and the sight of that had a very arousing effect on the blonde kunoichi. Naruto himself found the idea of licking Temari's brias while there was cream on them to be very nice, as it added a very new and undeniably delicious element to the whole situation, and the taste of the fruits was certainly welcome as he ate the grapes and then cleaned her brias. Temari's moans and cries of pleasure told him that she was also enjoying this whole situation greatly. "Oh yes, lick my brias like that, Naruto-kun, As soon as he was done licking off the cream and eating the fruits that covered her brias, Temari smiled at Naruto, and he swallowed the food and the cream and went on to play with her now clean and very much aroused brias, and she moaned out loudly at that action as she felt her brias to be rather sensitive if touched in the right way, and Naruto was touching in them in the way she liked a lot. Naruto moved down from Temari's Brius and made his way to her stomach, and he cleaned the cream and fruit and ate them all while tracing his chakra-covered tongue on Temari's stomach to make sure that he was able to pleasure her body the right way, and Temari was moaning out loudly to show that his actions were getting the right results. Naruto-kun, that feels good, right there, oh yes. Naruto made his way to Temari's vagina, and he could see that her cum was already mixing with the cream, and the sight of that happening before him drove Naruto into a frenzy of pleasure as he kissed and licked his way to her vagina and began to lick and suck away the cream, which was now mixed with her cum, and he ate the cum mixed cream and the strawberry slice that were there as well, and the resulting assault of sweet strawberries and cream mixed with Temari's juices had a very arousing effect on Naruto, and it had one too on Temari as she moaned out loudly at the pleasure that assaulted her senses. Ah. Naruto smiled and then went to work as he went back to playing with Temari's Brius with his left arm, and he licked her clitoris gently and carefully while using his right hand to pleasure her vagina, and the results were very much delightful for the blonde kunoichi as she felt her heart rate go up and her body continued to release more and more of her juices, which Naruto liked a great deal. And as soon as he was done playing with Temari's Brius, he moved to her hips and with amazing strength lifted her hips up, and she squealed as she realized that her wet vagina was now fully exposed to her lover. Naruto-kun. Naruto looked at Temari and she then spoke seriously. Promise me you'll never tell anyone about this, please. Naruto saw the embarrassment there on her face and he smiled warmly at her. I won't say a word. Temari smiled as she could see that Naruto meant it, and she moaned out as Naruto began to lick her vagina and her clitoris, and the feel of that was enough to drive her mad with pleasure as he licked her vagina and even pushed his tongue deep inside of her vagina, making her all the more aroused. He combined that by playing with her Brius once more and also using his free hand to play with her clitoris. Temari was being driven to the breaking point with all the pleasure that was flooding her body at this moment, and sure enough, the actions of Naruto's tongue, lips and hands on her was enough to make Temari orgasm. Ah. Temari came hard and Naruto lapped up as much of her sweet-tasting juices as he could manage at the moment, and there were traces of her cream covering mixed with her cum, and that made the juices all the sweeter for Naruto, and he lapped up as much as he could handle while Temari screamed her second orgasm as Naruto's actions made her orgasm once more, drowning her in absolute pleasure. Naruto then gently lowered Temari's hips to the delight of the blonde kunoichi, who needed to relax as she felt her two orgasms flood her body with so much pleasure that she would have sworn she would have gone mad with desire. Naruto relaxed and allowed Temari a chance to get her breath back. The blonde chunin then kissed his lover from Suna, and she kissed him with absolute passion back as she couldn't get enough of being with her lover in any fashion. The kiss allowed them to taste each other as well as the cream and fruit that Naruto had taken off of her body previously, and the resulting taste was intoxicating for Temari, and she was getting quite comfortable with the idea of doing this again with Naruto. As soon as they broke the torrid kiss between the two of them, the blonde chunin got ready and positioned his COC there and looked at Temari, and he couldn't help but ask if she was a virgin. Temari-chan. I hate to ask, but. Temari, however, was very intelligent as she had shown in her battle with Shikamaru, and she knew just what Naruto's question was, and truth be told, she found it rather nice that he was willing to ask her this question despite the fact that she knew that most young women her age would have slapped Naruto or any other boy who would ask them such a personal question. Yes, I am. Oh, I know that I have to break your virginity to make you a woman, but I really don't want to hurt you. Temari smiled and replied. You don't have to worry, Naruto-kun. I am a ninja and I have been training for years. I think I can handle the pain. Besides, no amount of pain can compare the emptiness I feel if you don't go ahead and make me yours. Hurry, I feel so empty here. Naruto nodded, and as soon as he was in a good position he pushed his COC deeply into Temari, and he did so slowly as despite her assurances that she would be alright, he wanted to make sure that he would make this a pleasurable experience for Temari, and that was why he moved slowly into her, and the blonde chunin resisted the urges of his body to go and thrust deeply into Temari's vagina to relieve the hunger that he was feeling at the moment. As soon as he was deep inside of Temari, who had been moaning all the while at the pleasure that she was feeling as Naruto drove deeper into her tight, wet, soft, and hot sex, he relaxed and then felt her maidenhead and gave a look sympathy to her and then pushed deeply, feeling Temari's virginal barrier give way, and he was deep inside of her. Temari gave only a slight groan as she felt her maidenhead tear away. It was not very painful, just a bit discomforting for her in a moment or two. Her words on her maidenhead being weakened by her ninja training proved true, as she felt little pain, and instead of the pain that women normally felt, she felt a deep fullness instead, and she relished the sensations of being filled by her lover's COC. Temari moaned even more and then moved her hips to make Naruto move his hips for the two of them to feel the pleasure that the two of them wanted deeply, and Naruto was more than willing and eager to provide that most sought after pleasure. He moved his hips and Temari moaned out as Naruto did as well. For her, the feeling of her vagina being filled by her lover's COC was sensation she began to love deeply, and for Naruto, he was amazed how tight, hot, soft, and wet Temari's vagina was, and it was a bit different in the feeling, making him even more aroused by the second. Oh, yes, right there. Naruto drew his hips back until only the tip of his COC was in Temari's vagina, and before she could moan out in disappointment, he pushed right back into her, thrusting hard and deep, making Temari moan out very happily at the sensations that he was giving her. The two of them kissed deeply, and Temari wrapped her strong legs around her lover's hips and got ready to have him move his COC in and out of her warm and willing body. All the while, Tenten and Ayame were also setting things up for Naruto's next delicious meal, and Tenten was happy to be next in line for pleasuring Naruto. Temari held Naruto and then the two of them kissed one another deeply, so in order to feel even closer and more tied to one another. As they kissed, Naruto slowly moved his hips and his COC in and out of Temari's vagina, which was milking him very hungrily. With each slow and deep thrust he made, Temari and Naruto kissed one another deeper, and they did the same thing with their tongues, dueling and rubbing their tongues with the other's own, and that made both of them moan out even louder. The kiss lasted for a long while as Naruto continued to thrust into Temari's hot and eager vagina, and he slowly began to pick up the pace. When the two of them finally parted from one another, the blonde Chunin looked his lover and saw the deep blush in Temari's face and considered that to be very beautiful, as he was the only man who was going to see Temari in this state of body, mind and soul, and he relished that fact very much, and he once more played with her full and well-formed brias, much to her delight, and she proved that as she reached out and ran her hands on his well-formed and muscled body. Naruto-kun. You feel so good, harder, please, harder. Temari-chan. You are beautiful. The two continued with their actions, and it was not long before Naruto was pounding hard and deep into Temari's wet and eager SX, and the pleasure for the two of them was proving to be quite enjoyable as Naruto moved his hips while playing with Temari's brias with his mouth and tongue as well as his hands. As for Temari, she busied herself by touching and caressing her lover's hard-muscled and well-formed body. It was not long before the two of them finally reached their limits and both shouted out loudly at the very same time. Ah! Naruto felt Temari's inner walls ml equals ilk his COC, and he enjoyed the sensations as they ran all over his body very quickly, and it made him all the more happy to know that he did this, and without giving Temari any feeling of pain, he looked down at the blonde Suna Kunoichi and saw the still present blush on her face and the smile she had, and he kissed her, and she kissed him back in reply as well. Temari moaned in the kiss with Naruto as she felt his cum flow into her body, and it felt very delicious to her to finally feel it all in her vagina and flowing in her. She was happy that she had taken some birth control pills to make sure she didn't have a child yet. Now was not yet the time, and her brothers would not be entirely happy. Gaara would no doubt be a little bit more forgiving as Naruto was his best friend and they had fought well together, but her other brother would need convincing. However, she placed those aside for now as she lay there and enjoyed the sensations. After the deep and long kiss between them, the Kunoichi whispered into her lover's ear with a tired but very happy and sensual voice. Thank you. I think it's time you try being with Tenten and Ayame-san though. You were great, Naruto-kun. Naruto nodded, and that was when Ayame arrived and kissed him once more, and he responded by kissing her back while Temari rested from her very powerful and undeniably delicious orgasm. Ayame smiled at the fact that her idea had finally worked and that all of them were going to enjoy this night. For now, however, she would have a bit of fun before Naruto went on to try the next delicious meal he would have. The two kissed one another deeply, and then Naruto went on to lick and suckle on Ayame's brias and nipples, much to her delight of the whole situation, and Naruto was enjoying the situation as well, and it showed as he played with her brias gently and yet forcefully to make sure that she would moan out loudly. Ah! Naruto-kun, you like my breeds, don't you? Naruto nodded at that and Ayame smiled as she allowed him to play with her brias and she ran her hands on his COC while she was still blushing somewhat from the sensations of touching his COC with her own hands and she loved the idea of feeling it in her soon enough, but she decided to stop and then guided Naruto's eyes to another direction. Don't forget that another person is waiting for you Naruto-kun and I don't think she would like it if you decide to keep her waiting and the same for you to be kept waiting for a chance to be with the person in question, and this time, you will love this one course. Naruto looked and saw that Tenten was also ready for her own attempt at what Ayame had suggested to both her and Temari. In this case however, the brown-haired kunoichi of Konoha had some different food items on her. Like Temari she had cream on her body, but in a lower quantity. In Tenten's case, she had more mainline food on her body as well as cream with fruit. There were slices of tuna, mackerel, and beef sashimi on her brias and some slices of bananas on the inner areas of her brias and her stomach had small portions of cream with sliced strawberries, cherries, and grapes in a very delicious pattern, along with several sushi pieces and his favorite fish and crab cakes that were used in his favorite ramen dishes, making the blonde chunin highly aroused at the sight as well as hungry once more. And on her vagina was cream with small bars of chocolate and the sight was very delicious to his eyes and he looked at the blushing weapon mistress of Konoha. Tenten felt so embarrassed at the moment. This was the very first time she tried something like this and seeing and hearing how much pleasure and lust Temari had when she and Naruto were doing this made it somewhat easier for her, but now seeing Naruto hungry and lust-filled eyes made her all the more aware of how she must look to him right now. If anyone else, including her father saw her like this, then things would have gotten ugly, but she placed those undesirable thoughts aside and focused on the pleasure that was soon to come to her. Naruto kissed her deeply and that helped relax Tenten as she really needed to release all her tension at the moment and when she was ready, Naruto went to work and began to lean to her brias and with gentle actions, began to remove the delicious food on her brias and he ran both his teeth and tongue gently on her orbs of flesh and her nipples, and the sight of that was making her all the more aroused. Naruto-kun, that's it, right there. Naruto relished the pleasure of not just tasting Tenten's luscious brias and nipples but having food in his stomach to stave off any hunger he was feeling at the moment. As soon as he cleaned away the cream and bananas there between Tenten's brias, he kissed her brias once more and swallowed the food and then made his way to her stomach, lapping up the cream and the fruit as well as the food that was there on her stomach, making Tenten squirm a bit more as she got used to the sensations of it all. As soon as he reached the brown-haired kunoichi's vagina he swallowed the food that he had in his mouth and directed his full attention at her vagina and he could see that Tenten's arousal allowed her juices to leak out of her vagina and mix with the cream and chocolate there and that made him all the more aroused and eager. He got ready and began to lap up her juices and the cream as well as the chocolate bars and when he did so, the brown-haired weapon mistress of Konoha could only moan and scream out in pleasure at the sensation and the blonde couldn't help but admire the combined taste of Tenten's juices, the cream and the chocolate bars that he had eaten. It had brought a brand new meaning to the word three-course meal. As soon as she was cleaned of the food on her body, Tenten was able to sit up and then kiss Naruto and the kiss between the two was very long as Tenten had to admit that the taste of her own juices, the cream and the chocolate was actually very nice and she was remembering how sweet Naruto's own cum was when it was mixed with the chocolate cream that Ayame had used on him before. The two ended the kiss and Tenten got on both her hands and knees and shook her body before Naruto, inviting him and he was more than ready to accept her invitation. Naruto got in position and held Tenten's hips and slowly pushed his way into her SX and the feel of his COC being caressed and rubbed on all sides by Tenten's vaginal walls and it was something that was very nice in his mind and he drove deeper and tore past the barrier that Tenten had. Naruto had now understood that due to their ninja training, both Tenten and Temari were not in danger of suffering great pain the moment he pushed his COC into their vagina and that made it all the more simple for him. Ah! Tenten moaned out loudly as she felt Naruto's COC deep in her body and the slight discomfort she felt when her maidenhead broke was gone in mere moments and then she felt the discomfort was now replaced by a much different sensation, hunger. And she was already aware of what sort of hunger she felt and she moved her hips to try and get the message to Naruto and she moaned out her request to make sure he got the message. Naruto-kun, please start doing what must I feel so. I need something. Naruto knew just what Tenten wanted and he began to move his hips and gave that to her in a moment, and she moaned out loudly as she felt his COC move out and then thrust deeply back into her, and she arched her head back in the throes of the pleasure and sensation had struck her mind hard, and that was something that he was beginning to enjoy greatly. The thrusts went slowly at first and Tenten enjoyed it despite her desire for him to move faster and deeper into her. Naruto satiated that desire by playing with her brios with his hands and also licking her back and shoulders as well as her neck and earlobes, and through it all, he was using his chakra to touch Tenten's pleasure centers. And the action proved to be worth it despite his getting a bit tired. Naruto then began to speed up his thrusts and Tenten was in ecstasy at that moment as she moaned out and arched her back a bit, and that allowed Naruto to thrust even faster and deeper into her hot, wet, soft, and tight vagina. The position even allowed Naruto to rub his COC on Tenten's G-spot, making the kunoichi shout out her pleasure even more in answer to each hard, deep, and quick thrust of his COC into her sheath. Oh yes, harder, faster. Naruto replied in kind to Tenten's requests, and he was pounding hard into her the way she wanted, and it was not long before she finally reached her own inner limit as she came hard and fast before Naruto. Naruto_kun. Tenten arched up as Naruto thrust deeply into her for a moment. When he came as well, she arched back, and that allowed Naruto to hold her brios, and she turned her head to the side and both of them were locked into a deep and torrid kiss, and both of them could feel their combined juices flowing out of them both. Tenten was happy as she felt Naruto's hot and thick cum flowing into her vagina and filling her to the brim of her body, and it was heaven to her, and the deep kiss that happened between the two of them was certainly adding fuel to the fire that was her orgasm. She dueled with Naruto's tongue with her own, and when they parted, she smiled at him and kissed him on the nose and said, "That was so good, I know." Tenten lay down and Naruto slowly removed his COC from her dripping wet vagina and allowed her to rest, and it was then that he heard Ayame's voice. The young woman had busied herself and now she was ready to have her own fun. "Oh Naruto-kun, come here and look at me for a minute." Naruto turned as saw Ayame nearby, and she too was covered in cream, only hers was all chocolate and there were some strawberries and grapes on her body, and the brunette daughter of Tsuki was eager to let her lover have his turn with her. She beckoned to him and parted her legs to show her own cream-covered vagina, which was also dripping out her own juices. "Naruto-kun, come here and be with me. Ayame-chan." Naruto moved closer and the two of them kissed one another deeply, and Ayame reached for her lover's COC and rubbed it, unmindful of it being covered in the fluids of before, and she licked her fingers clean for Naruto's benefit, and that made him react all the harder. As soon as they parted, Naruto began to lick in his way to her brios, making Ayame giggle a bit at how slowly and methodically Naruto would kiss and lick her skin as if wanting to make sure that he gave her the pleasure she desired, and that made her smile all the more at how thoughtful and caring Naruto was towards her. The blonde chunin finally reached her brios and went to work and cleared off the chocolate cream and fruits that were there, and she relished the pleasure of feeling Naruto's lips, tongue, and teeth on her brios and nipples, and the sight of seeing her lover clean her brios and nipples was certainly worth every moment in her mind. As soon as he was able to fully clean her brios of the chocolate and fruit, Naruto made his way to her stomach and cleaned her of the cream there and used his hands and tongue to pleasure her body's pleasure centers with the aid of his chakra. Naruto finally reached Ayame's vagina and he could see the very same juices flowing out her vagina and mixing with the cream there, and he smiled and he began to lap it all up with his tongue and teeth, gently cleaning his lover's SX and making Ayame moan out loudly at the pleasure and sensations he was giving her. Ayame was also a virgin, and sure enough she came hard at that moment. Ah! The flowing juices mixed with the still present cream made a very delicious stream that Naruto lapped up as best he could until Ayame was totally cleaned of the cream and her own cum. Ayame then moved up, the two of them kissed and Ayame blushed at being able to taste herself in Naruto's mouth as well as the cream. As soon as they were done with the very torrid kiss between them, she lay back and let Naruto push his COC into her vagina, but she then spoke to her lover, as she knew that after this, she was never going to be the very same person anymore. "Be gentle, okay? It's my first time." Naruto gulped and knew what that meant in all. Unlike the other kunoichi he had already had SX with and loved deeply, Ayame was no ninja and thus had not undergone the training that would have no doubt weakened her maidenhead and that made him very cautious. "Ayame-chan, are you?" Ayame nodded and knew the reason why Naruto hesitated when he was halfway into her vagina by now. She was a virgin after all, and she had heard the stories about how painful it was for first-time women who were with their lovers, and fiancés and boyfriends. Some said it would pass, others were not so positive, and while she was afraid, she was touched by the fact that unlike the men she heard about who didn't care about the pleasure of their partners but only their own, Naruto was considering her own pleasure first, and she smiled. I'm ready, Naruto-kun, and I know what will happen. I am not afraid, go ahead. Naruto could see that Ayame meant those words, and he took a deep breath and pushed deeper, and sure enough, there was the barrier, and the moment his cock's head touched it, Ayame winced, and it made him even more worried, but he knew that there was no other way, and with a deep breath and a sad look at Ayame, he pulled back and then pushed deeply, tearing the barrier aside, and he was now deep inside of her. Ayame groaned out in some pain, since unlike the two kunoichi who had worn down their maidenheads through their ninja training, she had no prior training, and thus her maidenhead remained virtually intact, and the pain was hard for her, and so was it for Naruto. Seeing the pain on Ayame's face tore at Naruto's heart, and he spoke to her. I'm sorry, Ayame-chan. I hope you. Ayame shook her head, and despite the pain and the tears in her eyes at the moment, she spoke to her lover. I'll be alright, Naruto-kun. Just give me a moment, you're so big. Naruto agreed to Ayame's request and allowed her to take her time, and he helped her by kissing her and gently playing with her brias, and she smiled at that as she ran her hands on his chest and back and relished the feel of his skin and muscles, and that made her all the more aware of how strong and tough the blonde chunin was, and that made her very happy with the situation as she began to lick and kiss his chest, making Naruto moan as well. As soon as she was sure that she was relaxed and ready, she moved her hips to signal to Naruto that she was ready for him, and she rose up and hugged onto Naruto as she was now on her lover's lap. And Naruto was quick to pick up the signal, and he began to move his hips slowly first, and as soon as he did so, Ayame moaned out at the pleasure that was flowing in her body, and as soon as Naruto was nearly out, he pushed his COC right back into her, and she moaned at the pleasure that struck her at that exact moment. Ah, Naruto-kun. Naruto slowly moved his back and forth, and his COC moved back and forth, nearly leaving Ayame's vagina and then moving right back in to fill her to the brim with pleasure and joy, and she made that very clear to her lover as she kissed him deeply, and Naruto kissed her back as well. The two relished the closeness, and as soon as she was used to the pleasure, she began to move her own hips in time with Naruto's own movements. Ah, yes, harder. Ayame-chan. The blonde continued his actions as Ayame wrapped her legs around his waist as she moved her hips while on his lap, and the combined movements of the both of them made the pleasure for them grow, and it was not very long before Naruto and Ayame were moving together in a very quick pace, with Ayame moving her hips up and down in time with Naruto, and the pleasure gathered and built as Naruto licked Ayame's face and lips while she rubbed her brias on her lover's chest, and the pleasure for the both of them continued to grow. It was then that Ayame finally reached her own limits and came hard just in time as Naruto also came fast and hard as well. Ah, Ayame smiled happily, and the pleasure of feeling her lover's cum flowing into her body was something that she had never felt before in her life, and it made her realize that this was worth every moment and even the pain that she had felt before. She sighed and held Naruto tightly, and then as he looked at her, she kissed him. Naruto kissed her back, and they both relaxed as he felt her inner walls milking his COC still, and he felt even more relieved at the pleasure and bliss. Their kiss became soft and tender, and when the two of them finally parted, the young daughter of Tsuki had a smile on her face. That was very good, Naruto-kun. Yes, you certainly had a very creative way with things. Ayame smiled, and it was then that Tenten and Temari were back on their feet and were more than eager to get things underway. Ayame smiled and got off of Naruto, allowing him to stand up, and when he did, the three of them smiled once more, and Temari spoke. I think it's time we move on to the next level. Are you ready? Naruto gulped a bit and smiled, and all three of them made him back into the bed and then pushed him down, and they all got ready to have another go at him. As Naruto lay there with Ayame, Temari, and Tenten as the women were now closing in for another romp into the night, he couldn't help but think how differently he was going to look at fruit, chocolate bars, and cream after this night. Naruto had no time to react when Kurenai and Hinata were the first to make their move, as both Jonin-sensei and Genin student moved up to him and kissed him both at the very same time, and he could only respond to it with as much passion as he could muster at the moment. The two kunoichi were enjoying the three-way kiss at the moment, and as soon as they were done, they each sat side by side on either side of Naruto, and they took turns kissing him at this moment. As soon as Naruto could kiss Hinata first, he moaned out loudly and saw that he was now being joined by none other than Tsunade, Shizune, and Sakura, and all three of them were busy touching his COC at the moment with their hands. He could only look at the sight for a moment and moaned out loud as all three women began to use their lips and their tongues on his COC at that exact moment. The blonde Chunin was being treated to a very erotic sight at the moment as all three women would lick and kiss his COC, with Tsunade in the front and Sakura on the right and Shizune on the left. The master medic Nin, Sanin and Hokage of Konoha and her two students were already making their move on Naruto as he could only watch and moan out loudly as his hands were grabbed by both Kurenai and Hinata and they both allowed his hands to touch their brias, and he relished the feel of them in his hands. Hinata's brias might not have looked larger to some but they were actually well formed and Naruto had no doubts in his mind that given some time, Hinata would grow into a very lovely woman, and the same could be said for Kin, Ino, Sakura, Tenten, and Temari as well. Kurenai was enjoying this moment herself and while she had to admit that it was somewhat odd to be intimate with Naruto while Hinata was doing the very same thing, but since they had talked it over for some time, they had come to terms with the situation at the moment. The crimson-eyed woman moaned out loudly as Naruto's hand continued to play with her brias and she was getting even more aroused at the moment. The same could be said for Hinata. She did feel somewhat awkward at what she was doing to Naruto while her sensei Kurenai was present, and truth be told, she was a bit uncomfortable at the moment with this, but she reminded herself that she had already been with Naruto before with Ino, Kin, and Sakura, and since she knew that Kurenai-sensei was alright with this, then it was alright with her as well. Those thoughts were quickly placed aside for the moment as Naruto finally cried out deeply as he orgasmed for the first time this night. Tsunade, Shizune, and Sakura backed away as jets of Naruto's cum came out of his COC in large and thick amounts and the feel of the warmth of it on their faces and brias was very nice and they quickly took turns taking in as much of Naruto's cum as they could. Sakura was first and she took in a good amount of it while relishing the taste, thickness, and warmth, and when she was done, Tsunade was next and the blonde Hokage relished the taste, warmth, and thickness as well. Shizune was the last and took in a good amount until Naruto no longer could cum and the Jonin also enjoyed the same three attributes of Naruto's cum in her own mouth. The three kunoichi then swallowed Naruto's cum before him and the sight of it was so arousing to the blonde that he couldn't help but moan out loud at the sight before him. It was then that Anko, Kurenai, Hinata, Ino, Temari, Kin, Ayame, and Tenten made their moves and gave Naruto a hell of a show. Hinata, Ino, and Kin moved to Sakura and with their own tongues and hands, cleaned the pink-haired kunoichi of the cum that was still on her body. Naruto could only gulp at the sight that was very erotic that he swore his brain was cooking in the heat of it all. Kurenai, Anko, and Ayame went to Tsunade and began to clean the traces and patches of cum off the Hokage's brias and face with their own hands and tongue. The sight of that was just as potent to Naruto's senses at that he would have lost all of his mental faculties right there and then. And lastly, Temari and Tenten were doing the very same thing to Shizune and as he saw that, Naruto felt like his heart was going to go wild and the speed of his heartbeat was enough to make him hear it beating in his chest and when he looked at his COC at that moment. His COC was so rock hard that it actually hurt him as he gazed at the kunoichi before him and as soon as the actions of the kunoichi were over, the younger kunoichi took their turn as Hinata, Kin, Sakura, Tenten, Ino, and Temari made their move towards him. Sakura was the first to kiss him deeply and was soon joined by Ino while Hinata and Kin kissed and licked his chest and Temari and Tenten moved to his COC and testicles and the feel of their mouths on his body was very much something that drove Naruto wild at the moment and he was loving every second of it. As soon as Naruto was done being kissed by Sakura and Ino, the four younger kunoichi made their way to his COC and they each took turns with licking and sousing it and the sight of six undeniably attractive young women taking time licking and sousing his COC and he cared for them as much as they cared for him in kind was mind-blowing for Naruto at the moment. Sakura was the first to make her move as she took in Naruto's COC deep into her mouth and licked it as best she could manage and she was using her chakra to further stimulate Naruto's pleasure centers in the same way that Tsunade had taught her and the way Naruto moaned out and said her name in the throes of pleasure made Sakura all the more aroused as she continued to suck and lick her lover's COC. Sakura-chan, There, right there. She then moved aside and allowed the shy Hinata to take the move, though being with Naruto in the most intimate situations seemed to remove Hinata's shyness towards Naruto. Hinata licked Naruto's COC slowly and gently at the tip first, and Naruto could only moan out loudly in pleasure at the way Hinata was going at it as she slowly made her moves, licking the tip, then the sides and finally the whole shaft. It was so delicious as Hinata wanted Naruto to enjoy her actions on him. And to her utter delight and pleasure, he was enjoying it as Naruto reached for her face and touched her gently and with loving reverence, making her all the more happy, and the feel of Naruto's COC in her mouth and the memories of how it had filled her vagina made Hinata all the more aroused and even wetter as her vagina began to release even more of its moisture, and it was taking all of her composure not to come right there and then, so aroused was she at the moment. Hinata-chan. Hinata blushed deeply at the endearment and continued her actions, and then as she was about to reach the limit, she decided to stop and then moved aside as Temari took her turn to lick and suck Naruto's COC slowly and effectively. Temari had not told Naruto that she had read some of Jiraiya's perverted books before, and while she was no fan of Jiraiya's antics in the books, she was a fan of how to pleasure a man, and now was the right time to place all of what she had learned from her previous night with Naruto to pleasure him once more. Temari-chan. The Sand Kunoichi got that part of her plan as she touched Naruto's testicles and then moved Naruto's COC up a bit and licked the underside slowly and started from the tip all the way to the base, and then she licked his testicles and she played with the two organs with her lips and tongue, and that was enough to make Naruto moan out very loud in pleasure and joy, just the kind of things that Temari wanted to hear once more. As soon as she was done licking the blonde Chunin's COC on the underside, she took it into her mouth and once more moaned at the warmth, length, and smoothness of Naruto's COC, and she relished it as she took it in and suppressed her gag reflex well, and as soon as she was done, she relaxed to get used to it being there once more. The blonde Kunoichi continued to lick and suck her lover's COC while Naruto moaned out his pleasure, and then as soon as she had taken in as much as she could manage, another lady took the turn, namely it was Ino who took to the front, and she started by licking Naruto's COC and even pushing the tip of her tongue on the opening of Naruto's COC and tasting his pre-cum, and she licked it slowly to take the taste. As soon as she was done, she licked her way to the lower portion of her lover's COC and ran her tongue all the way to his testicles. Ino was eager and she licked Naruto's COC with her tongue and started from the tip to the sides, and the feel of it on her tongue was making Ino all the more aroused as she made her hands got to her own dripping wet vagina and her clitoris as well. The blonde genin was busy arousing herself while licking and sousing on Naruto's COC with gusto, with her other hand helping her hold on for the moment. As soon as she was done, she smiled and took her hand, which was covered in her juices, and moved that hand towards Naruto, who licked her fingers clean, making her blush bright red. Ino-chan. You taste wonderful. Naruto-kun. The blonde-haired genin then gave several more licks to her lover's COC and also licked her own clean fingers. Ino then moved aside as Kin took her turn with her chance to pleasure her lover and her savior. Kin reached for Naruto's COC and ran her lips on the sides and then licked the sides slowly, rolling her tongue all over her lover's COC, and the blonde Chunin moaned out loudly and she then hummed a bit, treating her lover's COC like an instrument, and since she knew the right sounds and pitch to touch the nerves in a pleasant fashion. And that made Naruto moan even more, and as soon as she took her lover's COC into her mouth, she began to move up and down while humming in a certain tone and frequency to stimulate the nerves in a very delicious way. Kin-chan. Kin was loving this moment a great deal, and the fact that Naruto was moaning out her name as well was also making her all the more aroused at her actions on her lover's COC. She finished and then moved aside as Tenten was more than ready and willing to go for it. Tenten smiled as she got into the act and started by taking the tip of Naruto's COC in her mouth and run her tongue all over the head, and then she moved to play with his testicles to keep her hands busy, and as soon as she heard Naruto moan, she removed her mouth from his COC, reached for his testicles and licked them as well, gently playing with them with her lips and tongue. She even gently suckled on them to make Naruto moan out even more. The young Kunoichi took their turns and Naruto felt like he was going to die from all the pleasure that was hitting his senses at the moment, and they even went in teams of 3 to even up the situation for not just themselves, but for Naruto as well, with Sakura, Hinata and Kin on one team and Ino, Tenten and Temari on the other. The sight of the girls doing this to him without any of them fighting one another or worse, and enjoying this night was really making him all the more aroused. He finally got to do something of his own as he took hold of Tenten's head as she was the one currently licking his COC. The weapon mistress of Konoha moaned out loudly as Naruto caressed her face and held her close. He then got off the bed and then began to move his hips slowly. Tenten didn't hesitate or stop Naruto as she relaxed herself and enjoyed the delicious sensations that were hitting her body at this moment and time. She merely relaxed her body and her senses, and considering how slowly and gently Naruto was going with his hip movements, he wanted to make sure he didn't make her gag or suffer pain. She loved his concern for her own pleasure, and the fact that she could feel his COC moving in and out of her mouth slowly was arousing to her for some reason. As soon as he was done, he did the same thing to the others who didn't mind, as he was gentle with his actions all throughout the whole time they were doing this, and it was not long before Naruto had finally reached his limits. As he came hard, the 6 female genin were more than ready to make their move on that situation, as they each took turns taking Naruto's COC in her mouth, and since he had quite a large amount of chakra and stamina, he was releasing quite the amount at the moment. Despite having come once already, some of each was on their faces and also their upper bodies and their brias. The 6 female genin swallowed the cum that they each had taken from Naruto's COC when he came and took turns taking his COC into their mouths, were now licking the cum that was on their faces, and then they allowed Naruto see the erotic sight of them cleaning each other with their mouths. Sakura and Hinata cleaned each other, while Ino did the same with Kin, and then Tenten did the very same with Temari. The sight of it was burned deeply into his mind along with all the other delicious images as well. Naruto moaned out loudly, and then the 6 female genin made their moves as they made him lie down, and then Hinata kissed Naruto deeply, and after the intense lip lock, the Hyuga heiress moved on to kiss her way to Naruto's chest, and that allowed Sakura to make her own move as she presented her brias to Naruto, and due to developing her figure a bit more accelerated pace from the dragon fire in her body, the pink-haired babe's body was developing a fuller figure slowly and surely. Naruto responded by licking and suckling her brias, much to her delight, as she moaned out loudly at the pleasure that was hitting his senses, and he responded by reaching out and playing with Sakura's free breed, and then he reached down to touch Sakura's patch of soft and wet pink fur between her thighs, and the pink-haired Kunoichi laughed a bit and spoke. "Naruto-kun, you pervert, ooh." Naruto slowly ran his fingers on Sakura's clitoris and also her wet outer vaginal lips, and the pink-haired woman smiled at the sensations that her lover was giving her. He might act perverted at times, but while she would hit him for it out in public, in the privacy of the room, she was more than willing to let him play out his fantasies, and the fantasies proved to be more than enough to get her blood boiling. Sakura then moved aside as Kin made her own move and kissed Naruto deeply as well. The former sound Kunoichi relished this kiss as she always relished her time with Naruto whenever she would get it with him, and she was more than willing to have some private time with Naruto when she was allowed. She presented her own brias, which were well formed and suited for her age, and the moment Naruto licked and suckled on her nipples, she was more than happy to show her appreciation by moaning out his name in pleasure. "Naruto-kun, your tongue feels so good." Naruto smiled at that as he continued to suck and lick Kin's brias, and he had no doubts in his mind that Kin would turn into a very attractive woman in the years to come, and he was looking forward to that as he reached out and ran his free hands on her back, and the Kunoichi moaned as Naruto once more used his chakra to stimulate her body's pleasure centers, and it was going a lot of good at the moment for Kin as she moaned out loudly in great pleasure and joy as each sensation filled her body. Kin wanted this to last, and she enjoyed it for all it was worth, and as soon as she felt her vagina release even more moisture, she felt happy for the moment at being pleasured by her lover and savior, and she moved away, and this was enough for a certain Sand Kunoichi to make her own move. Temari presented her brias to Naruto, and he was more than eager and ready to play with her rather well-formed brias, and despite her tough and serious demeanor, Temari showed a much more passionate and playful side to her personality and her more sensual side when she was with her lover, and she moaned out as he licked her nipples and suckled on them gently, and picking up speed as Naruto pleasured Temari the way he knew she loved to be pleasured. And Temari was very happy at the actions of the blonde Chunin as she moaned out loudly, and the blonde Chunin reached out and used his hands to play with her vaginal lips and clitoris, and she moaned out at the pleasure as she felt her vagina become even wetter from Naruto's actions, and she loved it all as she moaned out loudly at the pleasure that was hitting her senses. She then moved aside and allowed Hinata to take her turn with Naruto, and Hinata was more than willing to let Naruto have his way with her at this moment. Hinata straddled Naruto and she leaned on him, allowing her Brius to rub his chest, and she kissed him deeply despite the blush on her face, and she kissed Naruto deeply and rubbed her body on his, and he responded by kissing her back while using his chakra on the tip of his tongue to stimulate Hinata's pleasure centers. Hinata moaned out loudly at the pleasure, and it was not long before Naruto reached with his hands and with the same chakra technique, began to play slowly and sensually with Hinata's Brius and making her all the more aroused by the second as she broke the deep and sensual kiss between her and her lover. Ah, Naruto-kun. Hinata couldn't help herself as she leaned back, and that allowed Naruto to play with her Brius more effectively with one hand while his other hand made its way to her dripping wet vagina, and the very second his chakra-covered hand touched her clitoris, the highly aroused Hyuga heiress screamed his name in absolute pleasure as she actually orgasmed, and Naruto couldn't help but see Hinata orgasm right on him as she was still there, and he could see her moisture come out of her vagina in a light trickle and fall on his stomach. Hinata then moved away and Ino was more than ready to take over. The blonde kunoichi licked Naruto's chest and then made her way to his chest, and as soon as she did so, she made her way to his lips and kissed her lover deeply and relished the dueling of their tongues with one another, and Naruto moaned out in pleasure at that, and Ino then moved to straddle Naruto's head and allowed him to see her dripping wet vagina, and Naruto needed no signal to know what the blonde kunoichi wanted, and he moved his head and began to lock her vagina and clitoris. Using his chakra and directed it to his tongue to pleasure Ino's vaginal outer lips and her clitoris as well, and the pleasure that flooded her body was enough to make her yelp out in pleasure. Naruto-kun. Naruto continued his actions, and Ino was more than eager as she played with her Brius as well in order to make herself all the more aroused, and Naruto was more than willing to help her out as he reached with his hands and touched her Brius with them as they were still coated with his chakra, and she relished the sensations greatly. Ino moaned, and then she couldn't help herself as she came hard on him, and he lapped up a good amount of her sweet-tasting juices. Ino sighed in pleasure and then moved off of her lover and gave him a parting kiss and lick on the lips before allowing Ayame to make her move on him. The daughter of Tsuki took out something, and that something was a small tube of sweet cream, and smiled at Naruto as she took the tube and placed some of it to her tongue, and the very second she kissed Naruto, the blonde Chunin tasted the sweet cream which was mixed with Ayame's own taste. Ayame revealed previously that she had studied the idea of using food in lovemaking, befitting the fact that she was a cooking ninja's daughter, and using food to make a night out more interesting was right up her alley. Naruto relished the combination, and so did Ayame, as the cream made Naruto's own taste all the more wonderful to her taste buds, and the kiss deepened for the two of them, and then as they broke away, Naruto was greeted by Ayame's own Brius and he touched them, making the young woman moan out loudly in response to the touch of his hands on her Brius. Ah, Naruto-kun, you naughty young man. Thanks. Ayame smiled and she then moved away as Shizune made her own moves on him. The Jonin kissed Naruto first and then she moved closer, and like Ino had done, she straddled his head, but she positioned herself to face his COC, and Naruto held her hips and she smiled warmly as he licked his vagina and clitoris, and she then moved forward and then placed Naruto's COC between her Brius and moved her body to the sides and up and down, allowing Naruto's COC to rub her Brius, making Naruto even more aroused. Ah, Shizune cooed out at the pleasure that she was feeling, and she spoke to Naruto with her voice covered with pleasure. I hope you love that, Naruto-kun. The female Jonin then moved Naruto's COC downward and she began to lick his testicles and then ran her hands over his thighs and used her chakra to pleasure Naruto's body. Her hands touched the blonde Chunin's thighs and her tongue and lips were on Naruto's testicles and COC, and Naruto shouted out in pleasure at Shizune's actions, and she relished the chance to make her lover make those sounds in any possible fashion. Shizune then moved away and Anko made her move as she went closer to Naruto. The former student of Orochimaru made her own move as the Jonin placed her body in an angle, and then she made Naruto's COC lie on his stomach flat and she moved her vagina on her lover's COC, and as soon as the Jonin was sure that she got it right, she began to move her hips backward and forward over Naruto's COC, and her wet vagina began to rub Naruto's COC, and the way it was being done made Naruto all the more aroused as she could see the way he was blushing and looking at her. She grinned at him and spoke. Enjoy this, Naruto-kun, because this is just a prelude to what we're going to let you experience. As the women moved aside, the blonde Chunin took the time to relax his body so he could have enough energy for the rest of the night. Tsunade thought it over and knew that since there were 10 more women who was dying to get into doing the deed with Naruto and give him a night he will never forget at all, Naruto would be pushed to his limits. She wanted Naruto enjoy every moment before him, and he would not be able to do that if all the women demanded his attention at once. It was then that she recalled just what Naruto had done with Kage Bushin and decided to let that be the solution. It worked twice already and now was a very good time to use that jutsu. Naruto-kun, I think it's time you use that Kage Bushin no jutsu of yours. That way everyone gets to have a lot of fun without you being too tired. The others also agreed with the idea as they wanted Naruto to last as long as he could, and they wanted to make sure that the night for them would last long and make the night even more enjoyable for everyone in the room, not just for themselves, and for Naruto as well, as they wanted him to be at his best performance from here on out. Naruto nodded and decided to use the Kage Bushin once more. He made the needed hand seals and then summoned the needed chakra and was once more happy for the fact that he was able to use this high-level jutsu. It was not long before a large number of Kage Bushin who were very much not at the moment to be present in the room. The other Kunoichi and Ayame were more than willing to take their time and allow Naruto to try out the situation before him. Sakura grabbed at least 4 of the Kage Bushin, Ino took 3 of them, Hinata grabbed a pair, Ayame took the same number of Kage Bushin, Temari took 4 of the Kage Bushin, Shizune took 4 as well, Tenten had grabbed 3 of the Kage Bushin, and Kin took 4 of the Kage Bushin. It was not long before the other Kunoichi were getting ready to have their own times with their partners. This allowed Naruto to be surrounded by Anko, Kurenai and Tsunade. All 3 Kunoichi licked their lips at the fact that Naruto was all alone at the moment and now he was all theirs for the time being. The Hokage went first as she kissed Naruto deeply by the lips, and the 2 blondes were kissing one another in a way that would have put the way barnacles stuck on a ship's anchor to shame. Naruto was in heaven as he kissed Tsunade deeply, and as soon as the kiss was over, Tsunade smiled as Naruto was on top of her at the moment and made that known as she hugged him closer to her. The blonde Hokage relished the feel of Naruto's nod form on her own nod form, and as they looked at one another, she felt Naruto's COC pressing on her body, and she had a very wicked idea that she had wanted to try out when she had thought about it. Hey Naruto-kun. Yes. Would you like to feel my brias? Of course I do. I love the feel of them in my hands and my mouth and tongue. Tsunade smiled at Naruto's honesty at the moment, and she decided to take this situation a step further. She relished the feel of Naruto's lips, hands, and tongue on her brias and nipples, but now she wanted to take it further. Besides, she knew for a fact that Naruto loved this situation a great deal. Good, but do you like the feel of my brias on your COC? Naruto was quick to remember the time Tsunade had placed his COC between her brias, and he recalled with great desire what had happened. Yes. Good, but this time, I want you to move your COC, follow what I have to say. Naruto nodded and followed Tsunade's instructions as he straddled Tsunade as she lay on the bed, and the blonde Chunin could only feel even more aroused by the sight of Tsunade utterly nod below him and the sight of her seductive smile. He moved his COC between her brias, and Tsunade used her hands to press her brias together, and Naruto could only moan out loudly as the feel of Tsunade's large brias covering his COC was felt by him at the moment. Tsunade herself was enjoying this as she felt the heat coming from her lover's COC on her brias, and she nodded to Naruto to go ahead with his actions. And Naruto was more than eager to do just that as he began to move his hips and his COC. Oh yes, Naruto-kun, that feels wonderful. Tsunade-chan. Naruto was in heaven. This was the same as he had felt, but it was more intense now that he was the one doing the motions instead of Tsunade at the moment, and the sight of Tsunade below him, with his COC moving in and out of the soft vice of her brias, was so erotic that he could only moan out in pleasure and bliss at the sight. Tsunade in her case was relishing this as she looked at Naruto, and she looked at how the head of his COC would move towards her and then disappear between her brias in a very amusing yet very sexual way. She looked at Naruto and saw the utter bliss on his face, and it made her feel even more womanly that she had this much influence on Naruto. She turned and saw that Kurenai and Anko were looking on with great desire as well, and she nodded at the 2 and spoke. Come on, don't wait there all day. The 2 nodded and reached Naruto, who was in heaven at the moment, and both Jonin were quick to make their move as they each kneeled next to Naruto on either side, and as soon as they were there, they took turns kissing Naruto, and the blonde Chunin felt like he was going to die from the pleasure that was flowing all over him at the moment. Kurenai then took the initiative and took Naruto's head as he finished kissing Anko and placed his face before her breast, and Naruto was quick to react and took in Kurenai's right nipple and played gently with it by using his lips and tongue. Kurenai smiled warmly and allowed Naruto to play with her breast, and Anko was not the least bit envious as she knew her turn would come soon enough after all. For now, however, she grabbed Naruto's hand and then licked his fingers and then placed his hand on her breast, and Naruto, despite being surrounded by so much pleasure that was flooding his mind at the moment, was quick on the uptake and began to play with Anko's breast. Tsunade smiled as the situation continued to play out as she lay back and relished the feel of Naruto's COC moving in and out of her breast, and she would even lick the head of Naruto's COC when it would be close enough for her to lick. Naruto blushes bright red at this, and it was then that Anko made her move as soon as Naruto moved away from Kurenai's breast. The Jonin made Naruto kiss her and then she guided his mouth to her own breast, which Naruto unquestioningly takes into his mouth to lick and suck as well. Anko cooed at the sensations while Kurenai busied herself by licking Naruto's chest and then taking his hand on her side and did the very same thing Anko had done before, but in this case, after she was done licking Naruto's fingers, she made him touch her breast lightly and then guided his hand to her wet vagina, and the very second Naruto felt that, his recent experiences allowed him to touch Kurenai's most sensitive areas easily and made her moan out loud as she leaned forward, pressing her breast to Naruto's body and licked his neck and earlobe. Ah! Naruto was in heaven as he continued to suck and lick Anko's well-formed and well-sized breast while using his fingers to pleasure Kurenai's wet vagina and clitoris, while moving his hips and allowing his COC to be caressed from Tsunade's breast. It was not long before he finally reached his limits, and Naruto could only move his hips even faster as Tsunade was moaning out loudly and encouraging him on with her cries of pleasure as her breast continued to move in time with every thrust that he gave her cleavage. He continued to lick and play with Anko's breast while moving his fingers with greater passion and power while they were deep inside of Kurenai's vagina. All three women were enjoying this situation and were even more aroused at the way Naruto was acting with them. Naruto finally released Anko's breast from his mouth, and as soon as he was reaching his limit, he shouted out in pleasure. Ah! Tsunade and the two Jonin smiled as Naruto came for the third time this night, and Tsunade allowed her lover's cum to cover her breast as Naruto pulled back, as well as the cum that was on her face and her lips. Tsunade allowed Naruto to move off of her, and as soon as she could stand up, the three kunoichi decided to let Naruto have a very special show. Hey Naruto-kun, want to see something very special? What? The three women grinned and Kurenai replied. This. The blonde could only watch as Kurenai and Anko began to remove the cum from Tsunade's breast and face, with their tongues, and as soon as that was done, all three kunoichi made their move on him as he tried his best to pick up his jaw as his jaw had dropped at the utterly erotic sight before him. Man, if I didn't see it before me, I would have thought I was losing my mind. Naruto's COC was quickly aroused by the sight before him, as it was considered as one of the many fantasies of men, to see three very gorgeous women doing that before him in the new as well. He had no idea how he could be still able to retain his self-control at the highly erotic sight. The three kunoichi were far from done as they moved to Naruto, and Tsunade got behind Naruto and pressed her breast onto back and then nodded to both Kurenai and Anko. The short-haired Jonin grinned and turned to Kurenai, and Kurenai was a bit nervous as what they were going to do was going to be something of a first for her at the moment. Anko looked at Naruto and spoke. Here's the show we promised, enjoy it as much as you can, lover boy. Naruto's COC was back at full mast at the sight of Kurenai and Anko kissing one another and in a very sensual manner, and amazingly enough, the two seemed somewhat at ease, and at that moment, it made Naruto wonder if the two were more than friends. Not that he minded at that, what Kurenai and Anko did in their spare time was not something he wanted to bother, and as he looked at the two of them kissing one another deeply and rubbing their bodies together, he couldn't help but drool a bit at the sight. Tsunade smiled a bit at that and whispered into Naruto's ear. You like what you see? Yes. Tsunade gave a seductive laugh and spoke to Kurenai and Anko. Did you hear that, ladies? Naruto-kun loves the show you are putting on, make all the more interesting. The two Jonin parted from their kiss and nodded as Kurenai and Anko moved a bit closer towards Naruto to give him a much better viewing angle. As soon as they did so, Both women leaned to the side and kissed Naruto at the same time, and the blonde was more than eager to respond to the situation before him, and the torrid three-way kiss was further added more heat as Tsunade licked Naruto's earlobe and neck while using her chakra to touch Naruto's pleasure centers to further his pleasure and enjoyment. This action made Naruto all the more aroused by the second. As soon as that was over, both Jonin went back to kissing one another, only this time it was with tongues first, and Naruto could only stare in his highly aroused state at the sight of Kurenai and Anko using their tongues to duel with one another, and after a few minutes of seeing the very arousing duel between the two women. Anko and Kurenai, however, were far from finished as they finished their kiss, and then Anko made Kurenai lean back, as well as moving a bit to allow Naruto to see Kurenai a bit more effectively at the moment. Kurenai blushed but continued with Anko's unspoken commanded, and as was not long before Naruto was watching Kurenai leaning her elbows on his bed, with her legs parted and Anko on top of her. Anko turned and decided to tease Naruto. If you think seeing me and Kurenai-chan kissing was hot, wait till you see this, Naruto-kun. Me and Kurenai-chan have planned this for your personal benefit. This is what it's like when two women go and play with one another. Tsunade had to admit that she was curious and eager to see just what the two were planning, but she was not going to be idle as she once more used her chakra to touch Naruto's pleasure centers on his back and shoulder blades. As soon as Naruto was quivering in pleasure from her touch, she took it one step further as she moved her hands and took hold of his COC and balls and began to caress it with sensual skill, and she licked his ear with her tongue and spoke. Enjoy the show, Naruto-kun. Anko and Kurenai gave smiles at Naruto. Anko then directed her attention Kurenai, who looked back, and as soon as the crimson-eyed Jonin nodded to her friend, Anko also nodded and she smiled at Naruto, and then she made her move by rubbing Kurenai's brius with her hands and then began to kiss and lick Kurenai's brius, and the Jonin couldn't help but smirk at the look of utter rapture on Naruto's face as well as the moans Kurenai made at the moment. Naruto was in awe at the sight at the moment, and he couldn't help but grasp just how lucky he was at the moment as he was seeing two of the most beautiful Konoha kunoichi making love to one another in an erotic show for his benefit. There were no doubts in his mind that every young man in Konoha would kill to be in this situation that he was currently in at the moment, and they would no doubt kill him too for being in this situation himself. Man, I can bet the pervy sage would have field day if he ever saw this. Naruto looked on, and his moans were further increased at the actions of Tsunade at the moment as the blonde Hokage was busy touching his body in the places she knew would get the most reaction from him, and it was taking all of his willpower not to lose his mind to the sensations being given to him, and Tsunade caressed his COC and testicles, while her tongue was licking his shoulders, neck, and earlobes. The effect was making Naruto all the more aroused by every second that passed him by. As soon as Anko was done with playing with Kurenai's body, the two kissed for Naruto's benefit and their own as well, and then Kurenai took her turn and made Anko lean back, and the red-eyed woman smiled at Naruto and gave him a wink as she began to do the very same things Anko had done to her as the red-eyed woman began to play with her friend's brius with her hands and then her tongue, and Anko moaned out loud at the pleasure, and as soon as Kurenai sensed that Anko was ready, she reached down to Anko's wet vagina and used her fingers to play with Anko's wet SX. Naruto could only look on, and he was getting even more aroused at the sight before him, and Tsunade's actions on him were more than enough to stoke the fire in Naruto's rapidly growing libido, and it was making Tsunade all the more hot. Naruto managed to tear his eyes away from the erotic sight of Kurenai licking and sousing on Anko's brius while playing with her vagina with the use of her fingers, and he was able to see just how the other women in his life were handling the presence of the Kage Bushin. Hinata was being treated well by the Kage Bushin who were with her right now. She was having a deep lip lock with one and who was rubbing her brius, and the other Kage Bushin was also in the act as Hinata finished her kiss with the first Kage Bushin, and the two went to play with her brius with their mouths. Then one of them moved to go between Hinata's thighs, and that Kage Bushin began to lick her vagina, and Hinata could only shout out her joy as the two Kage Bushin were doing all in their power to keep her happy and well placated as she lay back on the floor. Sakura was having her own fun as she lay down, and one Kage Bushin was licking her vagina, much to her pleasure, another was played with her brius, another was playing with her fingers, allowing her to touch his COC, and the other was right next to her and allowing her to lick his COC, making the pink-haired kunoichi all the more happy to have company to keep her placated and pleasured as well. The cage bushin took their time, and then the cage bushin that was licking Sakura's Brius moved away and sat next to her head, and she turned and began to lick and suck his COC as well, and the two cage bushin played with Sakura's Brius as well, and the fourth cage bushin was gently rubbing and licking Sakura's vagina as well. Shizune was lying on the floor, and there was two cage bushin who were on either side of her, and she was rubbing their cocks with her hands while another was straddling her chest and moving his hips and rubbing his COC on her Brius, while another was moving his hips while holding Shizune's legs to his shoulders and rubbing his COC on her vagina and clitoris slowly and carefully, making Shizune moan out loudly as she continued to relish the sensations that was flooding her body at this moment. Ino was enjoying herself immensely as she was kneeling down, and one cage bushin was right behind her, and he was rubbing her Brius with his hands, and licking her earlobes and her neck while moving his COC between her vagina's outer lips, and that was very erotic to her at the moment, while the other two were having their cocks rubbed by Ino's hands, and she would at certain times kiss and lick their cocks. And then she would take them closer and suck them herself while they slowly moved their hips while she played with their testicles in her hands. Kin was having her own round of fun with the four cage bushin he had with her as well. The kunoichi was kneeling with one of the cage bushin rubbing his COC on her posterior and was playing with her vagina and clitoris with his fingers while she was rubbing the cocks of two of the other cage bushin who were on either side of her, and she was also licking and kissing the COC of the other cage bushin, and she was enjoying this immensely right there. The pleasure for the former sound kunoichi was delicious, and she was not going to stop at all. Temari was having her own round of pleasure as the four cage bushin she had with her at the moment were doing all they could to pleasure the sister of Gaara and Kankuro. The blonde kunoichi was kissing one deeply while another was rubbing her Brius from behind. The other two allowed Temari to rub their cocks with her hands while they were on either side of her, and she was enjoying this immensely. As soon as she was done, she guided one to lie down on the floor, and she straddled him and allowed him to lick her dripping vagina to her delight while she faced the other way and also to the other three cage bushin. One was already there, and she licked his COC and did the same to the other two, alternating from one to the other and using her hands as well. Ayame was busy taking things on her own pace as the two cage bushin were taking turns in kissing her while playing with her Brius and then her clitoris as well. The young woman was in heaven as one of the cage bushin went behind her and parted her thighs and rubbed his COC on her wet vagina and clitoris while the other continued to kiss her deeply while playing with her Brius, and the pleasure for her was utterly intoxicating, and she would not have it any other way as she kissed back even more with the cage bushin who was kissing her deeply. Tenten and her three cage bushin were also having a load of fun as she was on top of one of the cage bushin and was doing the same thing that Anko had done to Naruto previously and rubbing her wet vagina over the COC of the one below her who was also playing with her Brius, and she was kissing and licking both the cocks of the other cage bushin, and she was in heaven as she continued to do what she wanted to them. The smell of SX was so thick right now that Naruto was amazed that the smell had not left the house, because if it hadn't, the smell would have made its way to Konoha. The results would have been something that no one in the whole village was prepared for. And if Jiraiya got word of it all, who knew just what that perverted young again man was going to do. Naruto placed those thoughts aside, or rather, the pleasure he was feeling both in his body and what he was seeing being done before him quickly turned those thoughts aside, and he turned back in time to see Anko-kun, and he couldn't help himself anymore as he shouted out in pleasure as he orgasmed at the very same time. Ah! Tsunade felt the coming of Naruto's release at the moment, and she wasted no time as she stroked his COC and testicles for all she could manage, just as Kurenai and Anko moved to take as much of Naruto's now released cum into their mouths. Both Jonin were eager to take in as much of Naruto's cum as they could handle at that instant. Naruto couldn't help but moan out loudly as he looked at Kurenai and Anko licking his COC clean while Tsunade was still busy using her hands and tongue on him. As soon as he was licked clean by the two women, the two Jonin were already making their next move, and both women allowed Naruto to stand up and Tsunade joined them, and all three of them were now kneeling on the bed with Naruto, and he couldn't help but be aroused at the sight of them, and he was gasping. Anko, ever the energetic one of the Jonin, decided to give Naruto a bit of a chance to try something that she knew would be more than enough to get his blood boiling. Hey Naruto-kun, you want to try placing your COC through our Brius? Anko-chan. Anko smiled at the endearment and replied by allowing some her own saliva to go down her brias, and she then sent the signal by pressing her brias together, and then Naruto got the idea and began to push his COC in between her brias, and the feel of Anko's brias pressing all over his COC while he was pushing it in was something that Naruto had never felt before, but it was delicious to the core and he was loving it. Anko cooed at the sensations that Naruto was sending all throughout her body, and she made her pleasure known to him. That's it, push your COC right into my brias, Naruto-kun. As soon as he did so, Naruto's COC was deep in Anko's brias and he was reveling in the warmth, softness, and smoothness of her firm, big, and well-shaped mounds. Anko saw that and relished the feel of Naruto's COC in between her brias as she relished the memory it moving deep into her hot, wet, soft, and tight vagina before, and she spoke once more to her lover. Now, move your hips. Naruto did so, and now he looked down and saw that he was actually moving his COC up and down Anko's brias, and despite the fact it was different than being in either her mouth or her vagina, it was undeniably very pleasurable and delicious in its own right, and the sight of it all was going to be something he was not going to forget anytime soon. Anko relished the actions of her lover as she held her brias closer, and the feel of Naruto's COC there was making her all the more wet as she looked at her lover's face. She had thought this idea up on the go and she had never done this before, but seeing that her lover was enjoying this immensely, made her all the more happy that she took the chance to try this idea out. Naruto loved this as he looked to see his COC being surrounded by Anko's brias, and the feel of moving his COC through his lover's brias was intoxicating. He moaned out loudly at the pleasure while Anko was blushing bright red at the implications of what they were doing at the moment while everyone was watching the whole thing before them. Tsunade was loving the sight while Kurenai was doing the very same thing, and both women were also blushing as they were busy playing with their brias and vagina with their own hands at the moment. Anko then spoke to Naruto. Naruto-kun, do the same with Kurenai-chan and the Hokage, I'm sure they'd want that. Hi. Naruto looked at Kurenai, who smiled warmly, and she pushed her own brias together, and then she have Naruto's COC some licking to slicken it up a bit, and with that done, Naruto pushed his COC between Kurenai's brias, and the red-eyed woman smiled at the pleasure and sensations that began to flood her body, and she relished the sensations well. Just as Naruto was as he continued to move his COC in and out of Kurenai's brias. That's it, that feels good, Naruto-kun. Kurenai-chan. The red-eyed woman reveled in the feel of her brias being rubbed by Naruto's COC with every movement of his hips, and for Naruto, the feel of Kurenai's brias surrounding his COC was a very delicious sensation that he would not forget anytime soon. And the sight was also very much intoxicating for him right now as he moved his hips back and forth. The two relished the sensations while Anko played with her brias and vagina while watching the two go at it, and Kurenai herself loved the feel of her lover's COC doing this to her brias. It was certainly something totally different to the red-eyed Jonin, and she would have to consider the use of this technique at a much better time, and she couldn't help but blush bright red at the pleasure and the sight of her brias covering her lover's COC. He then looked at Tsunade, who smiled back, and it was not long for Naruto to be given permission by Kurenai to do the very same thing to Tsunade. As he gave Kurenai's brias a few more thrusts to make her smile and blush, he made his way to Tsunade, who did the same thing and pressed her very well-formed and firm brias together. That was all she had to do as Naruto rubbed his COC on her brias and pushed it in. Tsunade moaned at the feeling as this was very different to her mind, but it was far from being bad at all as she pressed her brias and allowed Naruto to move his hips, and his COC moved in and out of her cleavage, and the pleasure was very nice to her senses. The blonde Hokage looked at the pleasure on Naruto's face, and the blonde Chunin was moving slowly as he wanted to relish the pleasure that was shooting up his COC and all over his body. Oh yes, that feels so good, harder, Naruto-kun. Naruto nodded, and as he got before Kurenai, the Jonin gave him a deep kiss with her lips, and as soon as she was ready, he made his own move as he positioned himself before her very much wet and eager vagina. Naruto-kun. Kurenai moaned out loudly as Naruto pushed his COC deeply into her vagina, and she relished the fullness and oneness of being with her lover in every sense of the word, and she moaned out even more as Naruto kissed her ravenously, and she responded in kind, and when the torrid lip lock was done between the two of them, Naruto made his way to her brias and played with them using his mouth and tongue. The red-eyed woman held him close, and when he was done worshipping her Brius with his oral actions, Naruto began to move his hips back and forth. Kurenai moaned out in pleasure and joy at the sensations, and that was enough for Naruto as he began to move his hips back and forth, and the pleasure that hit his senses were enough to make him shout out in pleasure and bliss at the sensations. He moaned out loudly, but then his moans were stopped when Tsunade and Anko appeased on either side of him and then kissed him together at the same time. The three-way kiss, coupled with the feel of Tsunade and Anko's new forms on either side of him, was enough to make Naruto even more energetic, and Kurenai was getting the benefits as he thrust faster, harder, and even deeper into her wet depths. As soon as the kiss was over, Tsunade guided Naruto's free hand to his own dripping wet vagina, and Naruto felt his fingers touch her clitoris, and he moved his fingers gently, sending bolts of pleasurable sensations up and down the blonde Hokage's body, and she cooed with delight while her face was flushed with red, and she then held Naruto's head and guided him to her Brius, and Naruto was more than willing to do what she was silently asking of him as he opened his mouth and tongued her Brius and nipples. Much to her joy and delight, and he then took his time and pleasured her Brius while he pushed his fingers in and out of the blonde Hokage's vagina, making some moves to pleasure certain parts of her inner walls, and he was rewarded as he touched her G-spot and was rewarded by a shout of pleasure from the Hokage as well as the feel of her juices flowing down his hand. Naruto-kun. Anko was not the kind to be left behind in the excitement as she took Naruto's other free hand, licked his fingers and also guided it her own wet and dripping vagina, and she pushed in his fingers, moaning loudly at the pleasure that finally filled her body at that moment. The former student of Orochimaru relished the feel of it and rubbed her Brius on Naruto's body slowly and sensually to make things even more heated for them all. Your fingers feel wonderful. Naruto was in heaven as he was now using his fingers on both Tsunade and Anko while licking and suckling Tsunade's Brius, which made the blonde Hokage all the more aroused as she held him close to her. His COC was also being squeezed and caressed by Kurenai's inner walls, and the pleasure was flooding the nerves from his hips all the way to the rest of his body, and therefore it was very much heaven for the blonde Chunin as he continued to move his hips, and his COC was moving in and out of Kurenai's wet, tight, soft and eager vagina while she wrapped her legs around Naruto to hold him in place. Tsunade finally released Naruto's head, and the blonde had enough time to get some air and calm his breathing when the blonde Hokage began to rub her Brius on his body and then licked his neck and earlobe, using her chakra to once more pleasure his nerves. Anko was not to be left out as she also licked the other side of Naruto's face slowly and sensually, and she then moved her hands to his chest and his own nipples, and using her experience with Naruto, she touched his nipples in the right fashion, and he was making the right kind of moans that told her that the pleasure was getting to him. Kurenai reveled in the sensations of Naruto's COC moving in and out of her body as she played with her Brius and moaned out in pleasure with each deep, fast, and hard thrust of his COC into her vena. Naruto was crying out in pleasure as he moved his hips and continued to use his fingers to pleasure both Tsunade and Anko, who were doing the same thing to him in such a hot way it was driving him mad with pleasure. It was not long before Naruto finally reached his limit just as Kurenai did, and with pure blissful abandon he came deep inside of her just as she also orgasmed due to being filled to the brim with his COC and his actions. Both of them screamed at the very same time. Naruto-kun. Kurenai-chan. As she leaned back on the bed, Kurenai moaned out in utter contentment and bliss as she felt Naruto's cum fill her vagina and womb once more. She relished the feel of thick and hot liquid as it filled her deeply, and she looked at Naruto, who was also in a state of absolute bliss as she was, and she blushed even more. She hoped that when the time came, she could finally get the blonde Chunin alone with her and they could really have some free time for themselves. But for now, this situation was worth doing more than once. Naruto himself was in heaven as he felt Kurenai's inner walls milk him for all he was worth. And he felt like he was going to faint at the overwhelming pleasure and release he was feeling. The feelings of her inner walls milking him was utterly delicious, and the smell of SX in the air was driving Naruto mad with pleasure as well as lust as he slowly pulled away, and it was then that the other women made their move. That was also when the Kage Bushin who were with Shizune at the moment finally reached their limits, and that left the Jonin apprentice of Tsunade free to rest a bit, as she was covered in sweat after being with her companions for quite a romp. As soon as she felt her strength come back to her, Shizune made her way to join Tsunade and Anko, and then three women were going to have a load of fun with this idea that was coming to their heads, just as Kurenai recovered and she was ready for one more romp. Naruto had enough time to gather some energy and breath and found himself surrounded by the four kunoichi, reminding him of the first time he had been with all Kurenai, Anko, Tsunade, and Shizune. And the four women were more than eager to put Naruto through that event all over again, and this time with his knowledge on how to pleasure them the way they want to be pleasured. This would be more than enough to guarantee that Naruto would be in for the time of his life. Tsunade was the first to make the move as she kissed Naruto deeply, and she was quickly joined by Shizune, who was more than ready to duel with Naruto with her tongue, and as soon as he responded to their kisses, Kurenai and Anko moved to his COC, and the two of them began to lick and kiss Naruto's COC, and the blonde Chunin could only moan out in pleasure as both Shizune and Tsunade began to use their chakra in both their hands and tongues as well as lips to send bolts of pleasure through his body. His face was on fire, and so was the rest of him, as the four mature kunoichi were having a lot of fun making him squirm and become even more aroused by the second. As soon as Tsunade and Shizune were done with kissing him, they made their way to his COC, and both them and Anko, as well as Kurenai, began to take turns licking and suckling Naruto's COC, and the sight of all four of them doing this to him was very much something Naruto knew only men would be dreaming of, but here he was doing this with them right here and now. The blonde Chunin finally reached his limits and shouted as he came. The release of his hot and thick cum was well awaited by the four women, and they each took as much as they could from his COC, with Tsunade and Shizune being first and then followed by Anko and Kurenai. As soon as they took as much as they could, some of the cum Naruto released landed on their faces and Brias, and all four women loved that when it happened, and when then they were ready, they allowed Naruto to see this part of their plans.